What if I told you that yes, $10 trillion didn't just disappear from the US economy. It was moved, quietly, deliberately, and with the full awareness of people who still walk the halls of power today. What if this wasn't an accident, but part of a decades-long mechanism hidden beneath the official narrative of free markets and economic recovery? Because here's the truth. Nobody on Wall Street, in Washington, or even on CNBC wants you to know. America's money doesn't vanish. It gets reallocated. It's siphoned through invisible channels, derivatives, swap lines, repo markets, and off-balance sheet entities that the public never sees. And when that transfer happens, when liquidity dries up and paper wealth evaporates overnight, guess who's left holding the bag? You, the taxpayer, the 99%. So ask yourself, how can $10 trillion just vanish and no one goes to jail? This video will reveal how that illusion was engineered, how the very same system that saved the economy in 2008 actually set the stage for the next great transfer of wealth. Before we dive in, quick check-in. Where are you watching from? Comment your country or state below. I want to see how far this truth spreads. And if you're new here, subscribe, because what you're about to hear is the unfiltered truth they don't want trending. Let's uncover how $10 trillion was erased from the American balance sheet, and how the same mechanism is still running beneath your feet. To understand how $10 trillion can vanish overnight, we have to rewind the story to a place most people never look back far enough to see. It all begins not in 2008, not in 2020, but in 1913, when a small group of bankers and politicians met secretly on Jekyll Island to design what they called the Federal Reserve System. They told the public it was about stabilizing the economy. But what they really created was the most powerful private banking cartel in history, one that could print money out of debt and decide who gets saved and who gets sacrificed. By the 1920s, the US had entered a golden age of speculation. Stocks soared. Borrowing was easy. Sound familiar? Then came the crash of 1929. And just like that, trillions in paper wealth evaporated. But here's the thing. While ordinary Americans lost everything, the elite institutions, those connected to the Fed, and the big New York banks were already pulling their capital out months earlier. They knew. Fast forward to 1971. Nixon ends the gold standard. The US dollar becomes a purely fiat currency, backed by nothing but trust and government bonds. The floodgates of money creation swing wide open. Now, sound familiar again? Because every major collapse since then, 1987, 2000, 2008, 2020, has followed the same pattern. Debt expansion, asset bubble, sudden liquidity crisis, bailouts for the few, pain for the many. Let's take the 2008 crisis. The headline said it was about subprime mortgages. But beneath that surface, hidden inside the shadow banking system, a new monster had been created. Derivatives. Contracts worth hundreds of trillions of dollars that no one fully understood. Not even the banks that built them. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, that invisible web of leverage started unraveling. The official cost? About $700 billion in bailouts. The real cost? Over $10 trillion in global wealth wiped out within months. Pensions, savings, home values, all obliterated. And yet, while the average family was losing their home, Wall Street banks received emergency loans totaling $16 trillion in undisclosed liquidity from the Federal Reserve. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's straight from the GAO audit report released in 2011. They didn't lose the money. They moved it. The Fed called it stabilizing the system. But what it really was a controlled demolition, a strategic cleansing of bad debt off elite balance sheets while transferring the losses onto the public. Now here's where things get even darker. After the 2008 meltdown, instead of fixing the system, the Fed doubled down. They created something called quantitative easing, printing digital money to buy financial assets directly. Between 2008 and 2022, The Fed's balance sheet exploded from under $1 trillion to over $9 trillion. $9 trillion of new liquidity, created from thin air, injected into the very same institutions that caused the crisis. And while the official narrative said it saved the economy, real wages stagnated. Home prices skyrocketed. Debt became a lifestyle. They call it stimulus. But for the top 1%, it was extraction. Because every new dollar printed didn't go into Main Street, it went into Wall Street. Asset prices went up. Stocks surged. Executive bonuses broke records. Meanwhile, yes you, got inflation, rising rents, and record debt. So when $10 trillion vanishes from the US economy, it's not magic. It's by design. A system built to create the illusion of prosperity, only to pull the rug when it suits those at the top. Sound familiar yet? Because every major collapse in the past century, from 1929 to 2008 to the coming one, follows the same choreography. The question isn't, how did $10 trillion vanish? The real question is, who took it? Here's where it gets dangerous. When people talk about the 2008 crash, they focus on banks, bailouts, or housing. But the true mechanism behind the $10 trillion disappearance lies deeper, hidden in something even Congress barely understands. It's called the repo market, the repurchase agreement system. Think of it like Wall Street's private plumbing system for money. Every night, banks and hedge funds lend each other trillions of dollars in short-term loans, using assets as collateral. It's invisible to the public, but it's the bloodstream of modern finance. And in September 2019, months before the pandemic began, that system broke. Overnight lending rates spiked from 2% to over 10%, a signal of total panic behind closed doors. Within 48 hours, the Federal Reserve quietly injected $6 trillion into the repo markets to keep them alive. No hearings, no votes, no headlines. That's where the first part of that $10 trillion vanish began, through liquidity swaps, rehypothecation, and synthetic leverage buried in balance sheets the public never sees. But here's the kicker. Those emergency operations weren't a response to COVID. They predated it, meaning the system was already collapsing before anyone heard the word pandemic. And guess who was sitting in the middle of it all? Directing, designing, and profiting from every hidden dollar moved. The repo markets had cracked. Trillions were being funneled in secret. And only a handful of institutions were sitting at the control panel. So, who knew? Who benefited? Let's talk about the primary architects of this hidden liquidity network, the Big Four. JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, and Bank of America. Together, they control over $250 trillion in notional derivatives exposure. That's more than 10 times the entire US GDP. When the repo market froze in 2019, those banks were sitting on a mountain of leveraged assets that couldn't find buyers. Their balance sheets were bloated with collateral that no longer held value. Mortgage bonds, corporate junk, synthetic derivatives. If the lending stopped even for a day, the entire system would seize. So the Federal Reserve stepped in, not as a regulator, but as counterparty of last resort. They didn't print physical money. They created digital liquidity, credits conjured into existence, injected straight into Wall Street's bloodstream. The public was told it was just overnight funding. But documents later revealed over $11 trillion in cumulative operations between September 2019 and March 2020. That's where the Vanishing Act happened. That's where the accounting tricks begin. See, these weren't loans in the traditional sense. They were liquidity swaps, temporary exchanges of collateral that could be rolled over indefinitely. No record on the federal budget, no votes from Congress, no public oversight. Money that doesn't exist becomes collateral for money that shouldn't exist, and the circle completes. Here's how it works in practice. A hedge fund borrows $10 billion in treasuries from a bank. The bank uses those treasuries as collateral to borrow $10 billion more from the Fed. Then that same collateral is rehypothecated, reused again and again, sometimes 30 times over. Each reuse creates a synthetic layer of liquidity. When it all unwinds, the system doesn't just lose $10 billion. It loses hundreds of billions. And that, right there, is the multiplier illusion that erased $10 trillion in market value during the 2020 crash. It's why markets fell 35% in weeks, why oil futures went negative, and why trillions disappeared from pension funds and portfolios overnight. But here's the punchline. The money never truly vanished. It migrated, transferred from public markets into the balance sheets of central banks and private funds at fire sale prices. Sound familiar? Because it's the exact same trick that played out in 2008. The mechanism just evolved, quieter, faster, harder to trace. And the Fed's partners knew it would. You see, after 2008, Wall Street built a new insurance policy for itself, the shadow banking safety net. It's an invisible scaffolding of offshore vehicles, dark pools, and special purpose entities designed to absorb risk without showing it on paper. Trillions in assets, from mortgage securities to treasury repos, now live in that gray zone. When something breaks, those losses are shifted to that hidden layer, and liquidity from the Fed covers the rest. It's genius if you're the one controlling the flow. For everyone else, it's a slow motion extraction. Let's bring in the timeline. Sept 2019, repo market collapses. The Fed injects hundreds of billions. Feb 2020, the world hears about a virus. Markets crash. March 2020, Congress approves stimulus. The Fed floods markets with unlimited liquidity. In total, by mid-2020, over $10 trillion in US asset value had disappeared from the public market, only to reappear months later as record corporate profits, private equity buyouts, and a stock market boom divorced from economic reality. If you ever wondered why billionaires got richer during a global crisis, this is why. Because while ordinary people were waiting for $1,200 checks, the real stimulus was already being delivered, silently, through the pipes of shadow finance. And the people who knew, they weren't elected. They weren't even accountable. They were traders, risk officers, and central bank insiders. The architects of what one economist called the fourth branch of government. Here's a staggering number. Between 2020 and 2022, the top 10% of Americans captured over 80% of new wealth created. The bottom 50% lost ground. That's not an accident. That's design. They tell us it's monetary policy. But what it really is monetary capture, a revolving door between Wall Street and Washington, where the same people who designed the crisis also designed the bailout. Consider this. The former president of the New York Fed became a senior executive at Goldman Sachs. The Treasury Secretary during the 2020 crisis, a former hedge fund CEO. Even the architects of quantitative easing later joined private equity boards. You won't believe the name that links all of this: BlackRock. When the Fed needed an agent to manage its corporate bond buying program in 2020, it hired BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, overseeing nearly $10 trillion in assets. In other words, the same company that owned large portions of Wall Street was hired to bail out Wall Street. Conflict of interest? It's beyond that. It's systemic consolidation. Because through those programs, BlackRock gained access to financial data, pricing structures, and market positions no private firm should ever see. That's how control shifts. Not through coups or elections, but through liquidity. They didn't need to steal $10 trillion. They just needed to redirect it. And here's the most chilling part. This system isn't slowing down. It's accelerating. Today, over 70% of global financial assets exist in digital form only. Derivatives exceed $600 trillion worldwide. And every piece of that puzzle, from your mortgage rate to your grocery bill, depends on invisible algorithms deciding what money is worth. One wrong bet, one liquidity freeze, and the chain reaction could make 2008 look like a warm-up act. But you won't hear that on mainstream news, because they're funded by the same institutions that profit from the cycle. So what does this mean for us? The people who still believe that saving, working, and paying taxes build stability. It means the foundation we stand on isn't solid. It's synthetic. A digital illusion of wealth propped up by debt, leverage, and blind faith in central authorities. Every time the Fed stabilizes the market, it quietly transfers future purchasing power from the public to the private sector. Every bailout is a pre-approved tax on tomorrow, and every trillion printed without accountability brings the next collapse closer. Because when systems depend on infinite liquidity, collapse isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. We're living through an era where money no longer represents labor, production, or real value. It represents trust. And trust is the one currency they can't print. The next time you hear that the Fed saved the economy, ask yourself, saved it for who? The same people who knew in 1929, who knew in 2008, who knew in 2019. They always know, because they built the game. The only thing they can't control is awareness. Once enough people see how the system actually moves, the illusion cracks. So here's the warning. We are approaching the limits of the fiat system. Debt is outpacing productivity by over 400%. The dollar's purchasing power has fallen 98% since 1913. And the digital dollar, the CBDC, is already in testing phases. That's the final stage of control. When your money is programmable, traceable, and centrally issued, the cycle of crisis and bailout won't need justification. It'll be automatic. That's why this story matters. Because if $10 trillion can vanish once, it can vanish again. Faster, cleaner, with a single keystroke. So don't just watch this video. Question everything. Follow the money, not the headlines. And remember, systems built on borrowed time always run out of it. If you're still here, it means you care about truth, not comfort. So tell me in the comments, are we wiser now, or just walking the same path in better suits? Subscribe for more unfiltered breakdowns, because the next collapse one to be televised until it aches is already too late.